Hello, Linked HR. I'm Dr. Chris Wildermuth, your community chair, and this is one more flash learning session for the week. So this week what I'm going to do is give you a very brief preview of a presentation that I'm actually running for the Iowa SHRM conference that is taking place here in Des Moines, Iowa. Let me see, I have the next slide. It starts on October 9, it goes up to October 11. And I'm actually speaking on October 10 from 3:40 to 4:40, room 104. So if you're going to be there and you come to my session, please come shake my hand at the end. I would love to get to know you. If you can't come to my session, but you're going to be there, just let me know that you're going to be there so that we can find a way to meet. So here's a preview of what this presentation is all about. What I'm trying to do is to look into what inclusion initiatives are likely to work and which ones are likely to do harm, based on Dr. Milton Bennett's Intercultural Development Model. So let me just take a step back and share with you what got me interested in this idea of doing harm, or first do no harm, and what is it that can actually work in the first place. So a while back, I read this book called Leadership and Self-Deception by the Arbinger Institute. And the story that the book told was the story of a doctor, Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. He was a doctor in the mid-1800s. And he worked for the Vienna General Hospital, specifically in the maternity ward. And one of the things that he was very concerned about was the mortality rate in the hospital that was very, very high. And so the legend says, I'm not sure how absolutely accurate this is, but what the story was that when he went on vacation, actually, the mortality dropped. In other words, he started asking himself whether the doctors were actually killing the patients. And as the story goes on, the idea is that the doctors were also researchers and scientists, and they didn't have too much notion of hygiene in those days. So they would come to the maternity ward with blood all over everywhere. And of course, contamination would take place. And that's why when the doctors were involved, more patients were dying than when the midwives were involved. So the whole moral of the story was, could we possibly be doing harm to our quote-unquote patients or to our participants when we conduct any kind of inclusion initiative? And at the time, I was specifically thinking about the kinds of initiatives that try to develop people's intercultural comfort. So, for example, the classic diversity training. Of course, I understand that there's a heck of a lot more to improving inclusion in an organization than just diversity training. Please, if all you're doing is diversity training, you are missing the boat. There's a lot more you should be looking at in terms of your numbers and how people are actually promoted and what are the rewards and the barriers that people face. It's not all about diversity training. Diversity training is this little part. But even in the so-called diversity training, is there a chance that we could be actually doing harm? So that's what got me interested in trying to figure that out. And years later, I came across the work of Dr. Milton Bennett. Dr. Bennett is an American sociologist. He is the author of the Developmental Model of Cultural Sensitivity. I use his work quite extensively at Drake University with my grad students. And what was interesting is that based on the work of Dr. Bennett, another organization created an assessment called the Intercultural Development Inventory, which I use with our graduate students at Drake University when we start the Global Leadership course. So that is the basis of what I wanted to talk about. So let me first give you a sense of what Dr. Bennett says. The first thing that Dr. Bennett says is that intercultural sensitivity is not natural. And you can see the quote on the screen. It's not part of our primate past. It has not characterized most of our history. In fact, cross-cultural contact has typically been characterized by a mess. Bloodshed, oppression, genocide. So if you look at history, you don't see warm, fuzzy feelings between people with different cultures, okay? So basically here the idea is that what we're saying everybody should be able to do is not something that throughout history people have done very effectively. So the other quote from his work is that the concept of difference, fundamental cultural difference, is one of the most threatening ideas that many of us will encounter. So if you have strong beliefs and values based on your own cultural programming, changing those values or meeting with people, interacting with people whose values are different from yours is particularly threatening. It's not natural, it's not easy, it's not something that you just get into some online course that somebody created. Okay, so valuing differences is a very advanced concept. That's basically it. And just like you would not teach, I don't know, advanced trigonometry to somebody who doesn't know algebra, you have to go through a certain process. So let me go through the stages that Dr. Bennett has in his model. First, he says that there are two basic boxes, I guess, and then I'm going to dissect those boxes a bit. The first is ethnocentrism and the second is ethno-relativism, where in the ethnocentric stage, when basically centric, right? So the center of the universe is your own culture, your own group. Differences are either hidden or threatening. Either you don't see them, or you hide them somehow, or you don't like them at all. And when you are in the ethno-relative stages, then the differences are accepted, valued, and then you get even to the highest level in which you can actually not only appreciate differences, but you can even start interpreting things from the standpoint of a different culture. So just to dissect this a little bit more, the ethnocentric stages, or the first two ethnocentric stages, are first denial, and then the next one is defense. By the way, the terminology, you will see different terms depending on whether you're using Dr. Bennett's original model and the Intercultural Development Inventories model. But the meaning is the same, even if the names are a little bit different. So the first one is denial, and denial is you have so little experience with cultural differences that either you don't see differences at all, or you see just the surface level ones. So you may notice that people dress differently or they eat different foods, but you're not going to go any deeper than that. Whereas in defense, you do know that there are value differences and belief differences and differences that go under the surface, and guess what? You don't like them. You feel upset about them. You feel threatened by them. There is another level that actually Bennett puts as an ethnocentric level, which he calls minimization. And in minimization, you do see the differences, but basically you try to minimize them. So you basically say we have more in common than we have differences. We're all human beings. We're all, if people are religious, they could say we're all children of God. Now, a caveat here is that minimization can be a useful, I guess, transition phase, because you need to find some connection with people before you can actually appreciate differences between them and before you can actually understand them enough to move into the higher levels. So the problem here is not minimization. The problem is getting stuck in minimization, I would say. Minimization is the most common level where I see people when we do the assessment, where we see people be. The next two levels would be already the ethno-relative stages. So ethno-relative meaning, well, you understand the relativity of culture. So if cultures are different, they're neither good nor bad, they're just different, and you need to go to the point in which you can interpret them from the standpoint of the people from that culture. First level is acceptance, when you're able to accept not only behavioral differences between people of different cultures, but actually value and belief culture differences, which is, I guess, harder. And then adaptation is when you're able to actually interpret a situation from the standpoint of another culture. very difficult to do and more common when you have extensive contact with a particular culture. It's unlikely a person is going to reach adaptation for, I would say not unlikely, I'm just going to go on a limb and say it's impossible for you to reach adaptation in every culture there is. In fact, that's a debate out there in which you say, hey, can you really reach adaptation with every culture, or should you be really focusing on certain cultures by the time you're trying to get to that advanced stage in which you can really pick a situation and interpret from the point of view of somebody from that culture. Okay, so as you look at this screen, I would suggest that you even stop it for a moment. Look at these. So denial, difference is what? Defense, I don't like those differences. Minimization, we're all the same. Acceptance, I see the differences and I can appreciate them and I can value them. Adaptation, I can actually think from the perspective of a different culture. Where are you? And I would even go farther and say, where are you related to what culture? What are we talking about? Because I can tell you, for example, that when I'm trying to compare, I don't know, Midwestern, middle class, white culture, and then I try to compare that with urban, middle class, Brazilian, white, and I can navigate these two cultures very well. That doesn't mean that I would be able to be in adaptation in every culture that there is. Okay, so what? Why am I sharing that model with you other than be a boring professor coming up with a bunch of models? Well, a couple of things. The first is that we're usually very, very bad at estimating where we are. So if you take the IDI, the Intercultural Development Inventory, that's an inventory that was, well, if you Google it, you will find it. You need to be certified to use it. And Drake sent me to be certified to be able to use it with my students. What you see is that people get two ratings. One is their perceived orientation, which is where they think they are, and the other is their developmental orientation, which is where they actually are. And basically, we're really, really bad at estimating our developmental orientation. And inevitably, our perceived orientation is higher than we think we are. So when I ask you, hey, stop, take a look at that model and tell me where you think you are, I bet you that most of you said, oh, I'm probably in acceptance, because that's what most people say, okay? So when we receive the results, this is what we get. This is an example of, a sample person's score for the perceived orientation. But this is the same person's developmental orientation. So you notice that the person thought that he or she was in acceptance, but actually that person is in minimization. And this is not a person that had that big of a difference. Take a look at this other one. This person thought that he or she was towards acceptance, like almost at acceptance in minimization, but here's where that person actually was. So as you see, the first problem is that if we ask people to estimate where they are, their responses are not usually very realistic. The other problem, though, is that specific interventions work best with specific stages. And if we mess up and we try to teach trigonometry to somebody who doesn't speak algebra, in my metaphor, that would mean having an intervention that would be appropriate for somebody who is in I don't know, acceptance, moving to adaptation, but that person is actually in denial, you could do harm. So, for example, if somebody is in denial, cultural differences what? I guess they eat some different stuff. I had Chinese food once and it was good, and I guess I like to eat tacos, okay? So then what is the goal at that point? No, the point is not to appreciate differences. If you go too far, you might actually scare people and get them crystallized where they are instead of advancing them. So for those folks, the goal could be awareness. So yes, those celebrations and those parties and those fun movies and those surface level differences, interesting things, and then take them a little bit deeper. That sometimes the inclusion community say, hey, that's not enough. I know it's not enough, but it's a start. And what we want those folks to understand is hey, let's go a little beyond the celebrations. And now let's talk a little bit of the values. But what we're trying to do with folks who are in denial is to eventually move them to minimization. We're not trying to move them to adaptation yet. If somebody is in acceptance, though, so that person already is able to understand and accept cultural differences, then you can go much more in depth. I would say, now let's focus on one culture at a time, because people are not going to go into adaptation in all cultures at the same time. Considerable contact. Challenging conversations and experiences. So consider bringing immigrants. Consider sending this person on a trip. I'm excited because with our grad students, we're going to be traveling next year and having a very deep cultural experience in one country for a week and having contact with people who are there and truly understanding the culture there. So consider out-of-the-box interventions that will really help your managers, your leaders, key employees who really have to go at the highest possible levels, but do it with them, not necessarily with everybody else. So that's where I wanted to go. And of course, as always, I have some questions for you. And here are my questions. The first is, what has worked in your organization? I asked that question last week, but I didn't share it with everybody. So this time I'll share it with everybody in hopes of getting more responses. The second is, what hasn't worked? Like, do you have examples of terrible interventions that really didn't work at all? And the third is, I have a question for you. So if you have people in your organization who are in denial, as in, what cultural differences? I don't see cultural differences. What ideas do you have to progressively move them to adaptation? So that's what I wanted to say today. As always, happy learning, and I hope to see you again soon. Take care, everyone.